Hi, everyone. Meteorologist Bill Rentschler in the 1011 Now streaming studio, joined, as always, by meteorologist Carmelo Lattuca, but super excited today to have meteorologist Brad Anderson in the house today for the latest edition of the Weather Academy. Brad, welcome.
Thank you. Did you pick that theme music for that?
I did not. That was one Heath Miller, creative graphic extraordinaire.
Yeah, that was
Do you
beautiful.
Like the theme music, Brad?
I loved it. It was very beautiful and very inviting.
So today, we're excited because we're talking about hurricanes, tropical systems, Saffir-Simpson scale. I always tell people, especially school visits and stuff like that, you know, when it's really hot and it's really humid outside, the one thing is we don't have crocodiles and we don't have hurricanes. And that's why we live here.
That's right. That's what we should tell everybody. Nebraska cannot get a hurricane unless somehow the Gulf of Mexico floods all the way up to right next door. But
we've gotten moisture from hurricanes.
That is true.
We are not under any threat or duress of any real tropical system here.
That's right.
So most people, I'd say, in the state are fairly not experienced, not necessarily very knowledgeable about tropical systems. And so today we're going to spend, 10, 15, 20 minutes kind of just talking about what we know. I admit, as a landlocked meteorologist, my tropical knowledge is a little bit rusty. So,
yeah, I've always wanted to, experience maybe a Category 1, nothing higher than that. I mean, I don't want to get scared
I
or
don't know what
anything
you're
like
talking
that.
about. I've always wanted to be one of those reporters that's on the beach when the waves are behind them crashing. They're
Again,
struggling to walk in the wind.
I would like, maybe Category 1, maybe between Category 1, Category 2, I'd like to experience. But from the video I've seen of Category 3 and up, I don't know if I want to be a part of that.
No.
No Jim Cantori here.
It's on
We'll
my
send you,
bucket
Carmelo.
list.
Yeah.
I'm probably between Brad and Carmelo on this.
So maybe a 2 to 3?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just hovering the major status is what he wants.
I have one of my best friends in the world. She grew up in South Florida. And so, there'll be a huge, big hurricane coming in. She'll be like, it's whatever.
You gotta live with it.
And it's like, when we have huge tornado outbreaks, they're like, oh my gosh. And we're like, it's just tornadoes.
Yeah. It's like people in California are like, how can you live in Nebraska? There's tornadoes there. I said, well, you have earthquakes, which scares me. Go, earthquakes, they're nothing.
We don't wake up to earthquakes like Los Angeles did this morning.
Did they really?
4.7.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
The Malibu area.
Where was I? I guess I didn't miss that bulletin. No.
You missed that push notification
Yes.
On your phone. Okay, so we're going to start with graphics or the PowerPoint here, Carmelo. What do you want to
I
do?
think we should start with the PowerPoint.
Start with the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's a good choice.
So we're going to go through, again, kind of some of the basics when it comes to hurricanes, tropical systems, and then some of the things that kind of go with them. So names is what Carmelo titled this scene. Carmelo, walk us through.
It's all in the name.
It is all in the name.
Because hurricanes, all these tropical systems don't just start off as hurricanes. You hear them called a tropical wave, a tropical depression, a storm, and then it reaches that hurricane status. So when you have a sort of not a circulation that's closed off, you can see that rotation, then it's just a tropical disturbance. Once you get that rotation, closed circulation with thunderstorms, develops into a depression. The winds have to be below 39 miles per hour. I don't know why they can't go with 40. It's like the severe thunderstorm. It's got to be 58 or
I think
greater.
It's based on the kilometers, though.
It's possible.
It's based on the metric system.
Yes.
So when they use our system, it's 39 and 74. So
Yeah.
So
Can't just make it easy.
no,
round
right.
no,
Exactly.
not at all. But less than 39 miles per hour, tropical depression, 39 to 74, tropical storm, and then once we start to see winds above 75 miles per hour, and at this point, you're starting to see a really well-defined circulation. You might even see an eye of a hurricane, more likely with stronger hurricane status, but anything above 74 miles per hour then gets upgraded to a hurricane.
I stand corrected. It's not kilometers. It's knots.
Knots.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
knots is what they base it on, and then try to translate it to miles per hour.
My sister's on a cruise currently, and she texted the family. She left from Houston right as Francine was kind of getting going in the southeastern Gulf or southwestern Gulf, and she goes, "What's 59 knots in miles per hour?" Because that's the wind right now. And it's like
then
that's
I'd have to take out my
Right.
That's
a conversion calculator.
Figure that out, yeah. Exactly.
but yeah.
It's interesting, I believe, maybe you guys can help me out. It wasn't until, was it the 40s, early 50s, until they started actually naming the storms?
That might be true because we're going to go through some powerful hurricanes, and one of them on my list doesn't technically have a name.
Right.
So I think that is correct.
Labor Day.
I think they just started giving them like alpha, beta initially, and then they decided let's give them some names. And what were the names up until the 1970s, late 1970s, they were all female names. That's right.
I did not.
I didn't know that either.
They were all female names up to the late 70s until some women got upset that it was just always women they were talking about. So then they started rotating to men.
And so now it goes.
I think it
female,
alternates,
male,
right? Yeah.
Female,
Right.
male,
Yes.
female, male.
Yeah,
Interesting.
exactly.
I know that.
A list that they have 6 lists, and we'll talk about the names here in just a second. But they have 6 lists, and they rotate through that list throughout the year. So, ingredients for formation, though. Again,
Yes.
there are some very specific things that hurricanes need.
Absolutely.
And they have the very specific places that hurricanes can form. They can't just form out in the middle of the open ocean. It really has to be basically right on the equator, basically plus or minus about 5 degrees, either north or south, is kind of really where you want that hurricane to really develop.
No, absolutely. Cannot form right on the equator. We're going to talk about one of the things that you need. You obviously need spin. I think everybody knows when you see a satellite picture of a hurricane, it's got that classic spinning formation, and it's pretty interesting to see it from, a ways away. We don't want to be right on top of it. But so we'll talk about the spin in just a second, but one thing you need above all else, I think, is warm ocean waters. Normally you need them at above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. I think you could get away with 75 plus, maybe even 70 plus, but once you start getting into the 60s and 50s, that's why storms that go into the North Atlantic, they start, dying off, and we call them extratropical.
And that's why California does not get hurricanes, or extremely, extremely, extremely rare. I mean,
Very cool ocean water.
yeah, because they have a cold current there, and so they have colder water, and that's why they don't get the hurricanes.
And then that goes into, we haven't talked about it on the Weather Academy yet, Carmelo, but there are certain factors that determine location's climate. One of them, not only is proximity to a large body of water, but the current. So there's a warm current
Yes.
through the Gulf of Mexico up the eastern seaboard, and so that's what promotes those warm sea surface temperatures.
Absolutely. So warm ocean waters is one of them. You also need low wind shear. When we talk about tornadoes, you want a lot of wind shear. You want a lot of changing with winds with height. But when you start to do that into the layers of the atmosphere, that's actually going to kill off any cloud formation. That's not really going to make it sustainable for hurricanes to develop. So you want very little changing with the winds with height. Probably want them strengthening as they go up, but you don't want them changing with height.
Right.
So that would be speed shear, not directional shear.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we have here, we have moisture. You definitely need a lot of moisture. Classic ingredient with thunderstorms. Hurricanes, start off as just disorganized thunderstorms and eventually become this very strengthening, unified collection of storms, what we call a hurricane. But the spin, that's a really important one. So as the Earth rotates, it creates a force. It's the Coriolis force, I think we all know a lot about that from dynamics. We spent about a month or two in our dynamics class talking about that. But because of the rotation of the Earth, we have currents and circulation of air. It's not just very stagnant. It moves depending on where it is in the atmosphere and where you are on the planet. But everything is deflected, I believe, to the right in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the southern hemisphere. So that helps create that circulation.
And no, the toilets down in the southern hemisphere are not
That is a
affected by
myth.
the Coriolis effect. So that is a myth, right?
Yes, and that goes into, when you talk global circulations, that goes into also why you have hurricanes that form, say, off the coast of Africa.
Yes.
And then you have the easterlies from about the equator to about 30 degrees north latitude. And so that's why those storms move east to west across the ocean into the Gulf or into Central America or however. And then a lot of times we'll see those recurve. And there have been many storms that have then recurved and then gone all the way back as they get above 30 degrees north. The global circulation, you have more westerly winds. That's why our weather in the United States moves generally from west to east. But you'll have storms make it start off the coast of Africa, make it all the way, near North America, and then they get slingshot back around, and sometimes they'll impact Great Britain, Ireland, Europe, Portugal, areas like that.
If we had no spin whatsoever, I can only imagine what the weather would be like.
It would be boring.
It would be pretty boring.
It'd be boring.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have much of a...
One other point, we kept on talking about thunderstorms. They form into a low pressure system. They are a tropical low. They're a warm core low. They're not the type of low pressures systems that we have here in the
Correct.
plains. So we kept on talking about that, and it's a warm low. It's not a cold low.
It's not a cold low. And again, the big difference is, when we see a low pressure system go by, we're used to having a warm front and a cold front. There are no fronts with a hurricane with these tropical lows. And then when they become extratropical, that's when they then will have developed a feature like a warm front or a feature like a cold front with it as well. So to rate the strength of these hurricanes,
Yes.
again, we're used to the enhanced Fujita scale with our tornadoes. I think everyone knows, that scale. But the Saffir-Simpson scale is what we use, completely different, to rate the strength of hurricanes. And again, it is a little misleading, I would say, because the Saffir-Simpson scale is based solely on wind speed. But we have found over the years that really one of the most destructive parts of hurricanes is the storm surge that comes with it, and that's not factored in to the Saffir-Simpson scale.
Absolutely. I mean, there have been very powerful Category 1, 2 hurricanes that have done more damage than Category 4 or 5, and I think a part of it is how fast is the storm moving. I know we had Hurricane Harvey about 7 years ago, and its direction, I think, was stationary for hours at a time. It didn't really move. It just sat over Texas. So this doesn't even take into account flooding rain, because we have the storm surge, and we'll talk more about that and what exactly that is. But just the rainfall alone could be much more powerful in weaker hurricanes than stronger ones.
That's the thing. There are many more factors with hurricanes than just the wind. We always sometimes just think of, boy, how strong is the wind? Boy, that's a high wind there. But yeah, you've got the storm surge, and especially those, at sea level, when it gets 4, 5, 6, 7 feet or more, it's going to go right past the barriers and right into the neighborhoods.
And that was in Hurricane Katrina, which I think everyone knows about from 2004. It was the storm surge, and the levees broke.
Yes,
and that's what. Really
and it wasn't a Category 5 hurricane.
No,
it was Category 3 when it hit.
It was Category 5 just offshore.
Yes,
but not when it hit. So Category 1, 74 to 95 miles an hour. Again, just from a couple weeks back, July 31st, we had 80, 90 mile an hour winds. That's what you're talking about on a Category 1 hurricane. And again, those. See, this is where I'm a little rusty. So fill me in, guys.
All right.
Are we talking? Are these sustained winds?
These are sustained winds.
Okay, I just wanted to double check.
Yes.
Double check. So sustained winds, kind of like what we had on July 31st, between 74 and 95 miles an hour. The big difference is a lot of times, we get questions in schools: what's more powerful, a hurricane or a tornado? An EF5 tornado, you're talking winds over 200 miles an hour. And, not to say a hurricane couldn't have winds that strong, but when you get to a Category 5 or most powerful category, you're only talking sustained winds of 157 miles an hour.
It's so tough, too, because we're talking about duration of time. I mean, an EF5 tornado, even if it's moving slow, is going to be gone within, 30 to 60 minutes, usually.
Most likely.
But this is days-long events, if not a week in some places, so that's a tough one.
Tornadoes are usually very small and compact and intense area, wind. This can be a larger area of damaging winds, especially if it's a Category 5 with 190 mile per hour winds. So.
And I should say, too, again, these winds are generally measured by, it's usually Air Force people who are flying.
Hurricane hunters.
It's one of my bucket list dreams. That would just be so fun. To be part of the hurricane hunters.
I have a coworker, I'll shout out Crystal Harper. I think her last name has changed. She's gotten married since we worked together in Cheyenne, Wyoming. She was in the Air Force. She got out. She worked in TV. She got into the Navy Guard and then got back into the Air Force and went to officer training school. And so now I think she's a lieutenant or a captain in the Air Force. She flies with the hurricane hunters. I see her pictures on Facebook, and I'm just like, you suck. I want to do that so bad.
I'm not a fan of turbulence, so I'll let you guys go do that.
All right.
Bill, I looked it up. They allow 2 to 3 media people every flight. So I don't know. I don't know how we could do it, but
we'll talk to the news director and we'll go. But yeah, so hurricane hunters, they fly into the hurricane, and here again in landlocked Nebraska, we send balloons up to measure the atmosphere. They fly into it and then drop. Basically, the same device that falls through.
Correct.
Generally, the center of the hurricane, or they drop multiple devices and measure, and that's where we get these wind speeds from.
Pressure, all that information,
and things like that.
So with tornadoes, these are estimated wind speeds. We can actually detect these, and it gets a little harder once it gets really close to shore, but absolutely.
So we mentioned it, but storm surge really is one of the biggest things that you need to talk about when it comes to tropical systems. So, Brad, you have this low spinning, and there's momentum created by the wind, and that literally
start singing there.
No. Momentum that's created by the wind, and so we'll look at a graphic here in a little bit. But the front right quadrant of that hurricane, where the wind is pushing towards shore, and the hurricane is also moving because it's a low pressure system. So you literally have a little less gravity pushing the water down. You get this basically upwelling of water.
Bulge,
This bulge of water, and the storm basically pushes it on shore. So you go from sea level to all of a sudden, the sea has risen by 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, high as 10, 15 feet.
That's right, and again, the wind then pushes that higher water, that bulge, if you will, onto the shore. And like I just said a few moments ago, most shore, along the ocean, it's sea level,
if
it's
not below,
maybe 4. Yeah, well, in the case of New Orleans, but yeah, 4, 5, 6 feet of sea level, and then you've got perhaps a storm surge of 17 feet. That's going to cause a lot of problems.
Yeah, and then also, I mean, where are you at? Are you at high tide? Are you at low tide?
I was just about to say the phases of the moon are very important with the hurricanes.
Also a big one. Yep. So
Absolutely.
sometimes when you get it, everything's perfect. That's when you get the catastrophic storm surges.
And so we hear many different names.
Yes.
Hurricanes.
I don't see Willy Willies on there.
There are Australia. You'll have to fault Carmelo for putting together the PowerPoint. But in Australia, they're called Willy Willies, I believe.
Yes.
In the Indian Ocean, I believe they're called cyclones.
Yep.
In the Southeast Pacific, they're typhoons. They're just a bunch of different names,
They're just
basically
different names.
for the same storm.
Right.
Yeah. Western Pacific,
Typhoons,
the typhoons.
Yeah.
Philippines, Japan, China, they all have to deal with typhoons. But it's all the same system. It's a tropical system. There's nothing different about them.
And a super typhoon would basically just be, I think, a Category 4 or 5 hurricane.
Major
for us.
hurricane
Yes.
for us, right, exactly. Speaking of that, going back to that, that's the other thing. When we talk about major hurricanes in the Atlantic or the Eastern Pacific, we're generally talking about a Category 3 or
higher,
So
yes.
that's how they classify a major hurricane.
That is correct. And so, speaking of major hurricanes, Carmelo was nice enough here to kind of put together a list of some of the more powerful hurricanes that have made landfall. And again, there's a lot of different ways you can measure. If you're just talking about the
I think
lowest
this list,
pressure,
yes, I think this is
the
a
highest
pressure-based
wind,
list.
the biggest storm surge, the dollars of damage
Right.
caused. So there's a ton of different ways that you can measure. But Brad, I'm going to let you take Hurricane Andrew because I believe you named your child after this hurricane.
Kind of. Hurricane Andrew was 1992. My wife and I first got married, and of course it was headlines because at the time it hit just south of Miami as a Category 4. It was a very powerful hurricane. And so Andrew was everywhere, and I always just kind of said, and my wife agreed, Andrew, I like that name, I like that name. So 2 years later, Andrew was born, and that's why he got Andrew. So I guess kind of it was named after a hurricane. But yeah, I just remember Andrew, followed it on the news, and it was powerful, Category 4. Now apparently, over a 10-year period, and this is like the first time that I've seen this, at least that long of a period, they actually upgraded
Yes.
Andrew to a Category 5
After
because
the fact.
they had done a lot of studies from 92 to 2002, and they believe that it may have just intensified just before it hit shore as a Category 5 because of the damage it had done. Kind of like they do with tornadoes. They just kind of figured out, hey, look, this is more than Category 4 winds. This has to be this. So, yes, 10 years later, it was upgraded to a Category 5.
So it made 2 landfalls. South
That's right.
South Florida, and then again curved into the Gulf Coast, and then made landfall again in Louisiana.
Right. Well, it wasn't quite, I believe it was a Category 3 by
Yes.
that time. Yeah,
Yes.
so.
But most costly disaster to ever occur at that time.
Which is crazy. $60 billion.
$60
Yeah.
billion
Wow.
worth of damage.
And you always think about it was that bad, but if it had been just a few miles to the north and hit Miami dead on,
Oh, my God.
I mean, talk about being lucky in that situation would have been a lot worse.
Yeah. So next one, Hurricane Katrina. Again, I remember this one. I believe I was a sophomore in high school, Brad, just to make you feel a little bit older. But back in 2005, and again, we talked about it a little bit, but it was Category 3 when it made landfall. It was Category 5 just offshore, and again, I remember just seeing the imagery, the satellite imagery, and to this day, it's just, it's a horrible disaster, but when you're just talking about the visual imagery, it's really a stunning image to see that hurricane just off the coast of Louisiana.
Yeah, Category 5, and it was just the perfect hurricane, textbook classic hurricane. And so, yeah, it did weaken a little bit, but of course we know the story. The storm surge caused the problems, the levees failed, and then of course New Orleans being below sea level, we saw the flooding and everything. And it was very interesting because I remember when it hit shore and it was like, okay, well, there's some wind damage and stuff in New Orleans. They did get hit hard in Alabama and stuff, but it looks like maybe New Orleans, dodged a bullet. But then
The levees
as
broke.
time moved on, by the next day it was like, okay, we've got a major disaster here. So yeah, it turned out to be. And as far as the death toll, one of the highest death tolls we've seen since like way back into the early 1900s.
Yeah, almost 1,400 fatalities, and again, a lot of that because of the nearly 30 feet of storm surge. So just imagine a 3-story building.
Yeah.
I think it has the highest
A
storm
wall of
surge
water.
on record.
Yeah.
Almost 24 feet, I believe.
28 feet.
28 feet. Oh, my God.
28 feet.
Wow.
So just, it was just pretty incredible there. Hurricane Michael, this was actually fairly recently, 6 years ago. It was 2018. It hit the Florida Panhandle, and this was a Category 5 when it did make landfall. It had max winds of 160 miles per hour, $31 billion in damage.
Yeah, and it was relatively late, at least for
October.
hurricanes in the United States. So yeah, October for that strong of a hurricane.
Hurricane Camille, this was back in the late 60s, Mississippi Gulf. Another Category 5 winds, 175 miles an hour. This one was 24 and a half or so feet of storm surge, which was a record for the time. And 256 people were killed in the Gulf. In the Gulf area.
Yeah, and West Virginia, that was some flash flooding. These storms don't just stop once they hit the coast. They're going to keep going.
If they interact with the front, that's right, they can produce tremendous amounts of rainfall. One of the stories about this one was that a group of people in this apartment complex had a hurricane party, and they all were there. It was a pretty well-built structure. It looked like it was brick and all that stuff. But they showed the picture before, and then they showed the picture after, and it was completely flat. And I don't know if all the people died in that apartment, but a lot of them did. They drowned. So don't have a hurricane party.
No hurricane parties.
From that one. And listen to even back then they knew it was coming.
So number one on our list is, again, Carmelo, you mentioned this, but this is before they really named hurricanes. Yes. The Labor Day hurricane, this is back in the 1930s. This holds the record for the lowest central pressure.
Right.
892 millibars. And again, just for some perspective, a low pressure system for us, probably like, 980 in Nebraska, something like that. And this is over 80 millibars lower than that. Your ears are definitely popping.
Yeah. You said that was number one?
Number one.
Because you have to have an honorable mention then.
Honorable mention.
You've got to have the Galveston hurricane
Galveston in 1900.
Yes.
Not a lot of information there, but they figure it was probably a Category 3. But it is the disaster that has caused the most loss of life in all of U.S. history as far as natural disasters. So they don't even know for sure how many it was.
Right.
They say between 6,000 and
Oh,
12,000, but there are some people who say there might have been more because there were more people there that were never accounted for. I read a book on this.
Isaac Storm.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
It's a good book.
About an early meteorologist that was there. It was a great book. But just even after this disaster, the problems they had, and you think of Galveston was just kind of a small town and stuff like that, just kind of get going, but it caused all that kind of damage. So maybe not the strongest hurricane, but it is the deadliest hurricane in American history.
Yeah, definitely an honorable mention. But the Labor Day hurricane, 892 millibar central pressure, Category 5, max wind 185 miles per hour and 20 feet of storm surge, and this hit the Florida Keys. So didn't necessarily.
You don't really need that much water. I mean, to
Yeah.
inundate that kind of area.
Yeah.
It's already in a little island by itself.
Yeah. Yep.
So some pretty incredible hurricanes hitting the mainland, and again in the coastal areas of the United States. So getting into some of the other stuff, hurricane names, we mentioned it, but there are hurricanes like Andrew that are more notable. That name is then retired.
Right.
It's taken off of the list.
Never see it again.
Never seen again. Katrina is on that
Absolutely.
list. There's a number of them. If you want to look them up, you can easily search that online. But this is the list that we have this year. Again, they have 6 lists, and they rotate through those lists. I'm happy to say I am on the list this year. Hurricane William
Yes.
will be the very last
Got a ways to
one.
go, Bill.
We do have a ways to
You
go.
actually have potential to have 2 because we call you Bill, and there is a hurricane.
2027, it's
on
coming
the
up.
list,
Yep.
And then you've got William. So
He's got a good chance with that one. I mean, that would be the second name storm of the season.
Yeah, but if it's an early storm,
Yes.
sometimes doesn't happen so
But see, I need to write a letter, and I need support from you guys that in all the lists and in all the retired names,
There's no Brad?
there has never been a B name named Hurricane Brad.
What?
And then, it's such a simple
I mean,
name.
I would support that
I will support
that
that.
letter
I think
because the
so.
fact that I'm on the supplemental list for the Eastern Pacific, if they go through all the names they hit C, it'll be my name, but Brad isn't on any
Not
list.
on anything.
That's crazy.
Nothing. No. So I'm
And
just-
so if you get through the list, which has happened, if you go back, I believe it was 2020.
2020, I want to say
through the list
2005, maybe. I think it's happened twice.
a couple times.
Yeah.
But then they would, or they did.
They did.
They'd go to the Greek alphabet, and
No longer.
There was like 30 or 32, 34 storms that, and so they got
my God.
into the Greek alphabet
They did.
ways too.
Yeah.
And you got, I mean, everyone I think knows alpha, beta, whatever, but they were getting into like
Gamma.
iota and
Yeah.
It
And
was-
here's the thing, though. I mean, if you had a bad one, I mean, can you really retire,
retire it?
alpha
No.
or gamma?
you can't, you
I don't
cannot.
know what they would do.
And it should also be pointed out they do exclude some of the letters of the alphabet in their name list. So like there's no X,
Right. Q, there's no Q.
no Q, no Y,
No Z.
no
Okay,
Z,
yeah.
and over the years they have tried to include some more, say non-traditional names or more traditional names for other countries. So a lot of times we'll have
Latin American
Latin
names.
American
That has
names,
made them- yeah.
and so a lot of times you'll look at the list and you'll think that's how the name is pronounced, but it is not pronounced that way at all. And so
Yeah.
I think this year this list it's fairly straightforward in terms of the names and the pronunciations, but sometimes you got to be careful.
Yes.
Yep. And you can see that it's alternating male-female.
Yes.
Yeah, I believe that started in 1978.
1978. So we just had Francine that made landfall in Louisiana, Category 2. And again, it's already down to a tropical depression. Again, really quickly, once these hurricanes make landfall, they start to weaken very quickly. So again, once they do move inland, they drop pretty quickly from hurricane status down to now I believe it's a tropical depression. So that's our names. What do we have next here, Carmelo?
We have Gordon next. Gordon, Helene, and Isaac would be the next three names. And
And
we're
we
still
do-
fairly early into the
But we
to the
do have
list.
several disturbances
We do.
in the Atlantic that have a chance of formation. So we are in the peak right now of hurricane
Yeah,
season.
It is
so.
the peak. Although the forecast is a little bit, they forecast every year, and then they expected a lot more.
They did.
There had apparently been a cooling in the Atlantic, middle Atlantic, that caused some disruption. So we'll see. I mean, I don't know if we'll see as many as they had predicted earlier in the year, but it may get a little more active before it starts to wind down.
And so this is a nice interactive graphic, and we looked at this Saffir-Simpson scale earlier, but just in terms of wind speeds and miles per hour. But this takes into effect, I mean, the scale itself doesn't. But again, this kind of gives you an idea of some storm surge and other impacts that go along with this. So again, Category 1 hurricane, you're talking fairly minimal damage. You do have a couple feet of storm surge, and obviously those really intense winds. You could be dealing with some power outages and things like that. But things go up pretty quickly. Again, with Category 2, you're talking moderate damage, 5 to 8 feet of storm surge, which again that's a lot. It's a lot of water.
Yes.
I mean, that's a Brad height of water. Just
It is.
just moving from the ocean into the
That's
inland
right.
areas.
Yes.
And that's scary.
So, Category 3, then, you're talking extensive damage. This is where the major hurricanes start. Again, 3 and above, you're talking upwards of 10 feet or more of storm surge winds, up to 130 miles an hour. Category 4, 13 to 18 feet of storm surge. And again, we give these ranges of
Right.
storm surge. It's not tied. There could be a Category 2 that has 13 to 18 feet
That's
of
where the
storm
tide
surge.
comes into the
The
effect. You know?
tide, the moon phases, maybe even like the land or the slope of the sea. If it's a very shallow or very doesn't range that much in elevation, that can also add to the storm surge.
Shelf, the Atlantic shelf.
That's what I was looking for. I was looking for the shelf, the continental shelf.
Yes. And so, again, if we look at the tropical climatology, again, I mentioned this, it's a little delayed. Carmelo and I have talked about the power of the sun and how we need the power of the sun to really drive any of our weather, and hurricanes are no different. And there's actually a little bit of a lag because it actually does take a while to heat up something as big as the ocean. And so, again, peak heating is probably, through the second half of July into the first part of August, but peak hurricane season and the warmest sea surface temperatures don't head our way until August and into the first half of September.
Right.
And so September through October is probably our peak, and then things kind of begin to taper off pretty quickly once you get to the second half of October.
Yes, the Atlantic hurricane season is basically from June 1st until November 30th. So.
And so we talked a little earlier about Saharan dust. This is something we see on occasion make it as far away as Nebraska, but a lot of times for us it just leads to some hazy conditions and hazy skies. But you literally have dust
Blowing
That's
off the coast of Africa.
blowing off
And
the coast
into
of
the
Africa.
ocean.
Yep, into the ocean, and that dust basically works its way into the atmosphere. And Brad, it just saps the atmosphere of moisture, and it also helps to cool because it
Right.
also is reflecting sunlight, and so it's a hurricane killer.
Right, that's right. And I think we did have some of that earlier in the year as well. So
And we have satellites nowadays that are actually
noticed
looking specifically for Saharan dust layers that filter in. And so, again, not a huge day-to-day thing for our weather, but again, folks in the tropics, just keep a lot closer eye on the Saharan dust layer.
On the sand.
The sal.
dust. Mm-hmm.
So.
It's not something we can show, every day. I mean, it wouldn't be, helpful to show every day, but we can show the water vapor imagery, just the amount of moisture in the air, and you could see, there's going to be some dry spots, and that could be the Sahara dust moving into North America. So, pretty interesting stuff.
And then breaking down the hurricane quadrants, we have 4 quadrants of a hurricane: front left, front right, back right. And again, depending on which way the hurricane is moving, you have a side that you would rather be on and a side that you would rather not be on.
Yeah.
So, Carmelo, take us through the right front quadrant and why it's terrible.
It's terrible because you have the combination of the direction of the storm and the strength of the speeds moving at the same point, basically. You also have these outer bands of the storm. So we know the toughest and the strongest winds are really close to the eye of the hurricane. That's what we're talking about, that maximum sustained wind speed that you see. So if you say Category 1 hurricane, those 75-mile-per-hour winds usually closer to the center. But you have these outer bands that can spiral around the storm. And these are ones that we are concerned with possible tornadoes. You really don't see tornadoes closer to the eye of the hurricane, but these individual thunderstorms moving, sometimes could be 50 to 100 miles away from the center, can actually cause tornadoes to develop. And there could be a lot of tornadoes, actually.
And usually when it makes landfall, there's not only that, but there's they believe there's the friction of the land as the bands are moving over can cause the spin-ups. Now, usually those tornadoes are nowhere near the strength that we can see around here, but they still can cause damage and problems.
But it's so conflicting because you could have flooding rains, and you're not going to be in your basement if there's a flooding rain, and then tornado warning, where are you supposed to go? That could be a really tough, how do you weigh those kind of things?
Right. This is what Bill fears the most when he goes to school and visits, when the kid asks, what do you do if your basement's flooded and you have a tornado? What do you do then?
You are in between a rock and a hard place.
Yes, absolutely.
That is when you pray to whatever it is that you believe in most in the world and just hope for the best.
That's right.
But left rear is the best quadrant to likely be in. Again, if you just kind of think about it logically, the water is kind of being sucked away from you into the front right quadrant.
Right.
You also have winds that aren't not quite as strong maybe on that left rear. Also, the severe weather is not nearly as prevalent in that quadrant as well. So again, this is why landfall makes a big difference. When you're talking a hurricane that's potentially several hundred miles wide, just a few miles can make a really big difference on who's potentially seeing that right front versus right left, or left front versus right front quadrants make landfall and things like that makes a big difference.
And we've talked about it. We've said the eye of the hurricane, but that's actually it's the best and the worst place to be in at the same time, because you might get 5 to 15 minutes, maybe a little longer, but I guess it depends on the speed of the hurricane.
Speed and how big the eye is.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the calmest part of the hurricane. So, you could literally see sunshine, and you can see this entire storm rotating around you. You might think, oh, I'm in the all clear. Yeah. I can start getting out of my house. Let me start picking up the damage, cleaning it up. And oftentimes, more often than not, the backside of the hurricane can have stronger winds than when you were before the eye of the hurricane. So, very misleading, very tough, and you definitely don't want to be in the eye. I'm sure it would be a very, picturesque picture, but...
Yeah, and I think a lot of, people on the Gulf Coast probably realize that eye thing, but, a long time ago, before satellites, and, people probably did think the storm was over, and they went out and were injured or even killed back then.
And so one thing I want to finish with before we wrap up, that I think you got to talk about is the forecast cone.
Cone of uncertainty.
It is the cone of uncertainty, and what you see us use sometimes when maybe the weather here is quiet, so we'll show a hurricane track or whatever it is. That is, they're saying the hurricane could be anywhere within this cone.
The center of the hurricane, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. The center of the hurricane can be anywhere within this cone. And over the last 10, 15 years, if you look at some of the overlays of the National Hurricane Center forecast, their accuracy has gotten really, really high.
They've done very well
in tracking the path of the hurricanes. The intensity, has been a little bit lagging compared to the track, but it's anywhere inside that cone is where we think that the center of the hurricane could be.
The last time that I remember, and I could be wrong, was Hurricane Charlie in 2004. Was like one of the only times that it might have veered out of the cone. It was about, it intensified, and then it hit more Fort Myers, and I think it originally was going to be to the north of Fort Myers, but it just kind of at the last minute did veer. So that's why, even if you're on the edge of the cone or a little bit out, you still need to pay attention to the forecast.
And the cone is based off what we call spaghetti models. You know, it's a bunch of models, and, we change the initial conditions, and it could say, hey, this storm could go anywhere in this general area, and the farther out you go, the more disparity there is,
Right.
that much
There's
distance.
more uncertainty.
Right.
Yep.
So, thankfully, spaghetti models are not something we have to dabble in all that much.
No?
They make
Sometimes
me
fun
hungry.
for, winter systems, where's that low pressure going to track,
I was going to say that maybe you should develop a cone for winter storms for Nebraska.
That seems like a lot of work, Brad.
Okay.
That seems like a lot of
I
work.
agree.
All right. Anything else when it comes to tropical systems, hurricanes, names, retired names, notable systems, anything else that we want to mention?
I don't think so.
I think we covered a lot.
I think we've
covered a lot of
covered
ground.
everything.
We kind of bounced around a little bit, but there's a lot to talk about.
I mean, we can
when
talk
it
about
comes
this
to-
for,
Yeah.
usually every topic we say this at the end
Let's
of it.
dive
we
more
can talk about
into
this,
the
right?
Coriolis Force, Carmelo.
Oh, my God. Let's not.
We did that enough in school. So,
Yes.
well, we appreciate everyone for tuning in and watching. As always, Brad, we really appreciate you coming out.
Hey, I had fun.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Now we just need to get Brandon. We need to get Ken over here, too.
We'll get all five of us.
I don't know if all of us would fit all at once. But that would be chaos. There'd be confusion and delay. But we appreciate everyone for tuning in and watching another segment of the Weather Academy. Again, we're going to talk again next week. Carmelo, have we decided what we're even going to talk about?
We start
next week?
doing this at the end of each one.
We
We're
do.
like, oh, why haven't we talked about what we're going to talk about next week at the end of
Which
our
we
talks?
No, we said we're
How
going to talk
about-
about the fall after the seasons.
Yes.
I think is what we're going to
Yeah.
Well,
Oh,
at some
Brandon, if you have a
point-
suggestion.
At some point, you need to talk about La Nina and El Nino.
Oh, the end.
Oh.
Because we're now kind of going back into La Nina.
Okay.
And what does
All right.
that mean?
Absolutely.
That means that the ocean temperatures in the Pacific are cooling, Brad. There's
Correct.
upwelling,
What does
colder
it-
water from
What does
down
it
below.
mean for Nebraska, though? That's what people want to know.
Yeah, but
It can affect our weather.
it does affect our weather, but how is always the $1,000,000 question.
Well, we're not going to spoil that for you right
No,
now.
we're
talk
not
about
going to
that.
give away the goods. Not going to give away the goods, but all right, we'll leave it there. So appreciate everyone for tuning in and watching. As always, keep it tuned to 1011, both on air and online, for all of your latest news, weather, and sports. Till next time, folks. Hope everyone has a nice Thursday.